Hello and welcome to another episode of the Strength Syndicate podcast with myself, Shane Story, and my co-host has returned this week. So here is Lawrence King. How are you getting on, Lawrence?
Not bad, man. How are you?
All good, yeah. Can't be better. Lot of life changes. Moved up to the big smoke.
Yeah,
Having
you're
a
full-time dub now as well, in fairness.
huh?
You're a full-time dub now.
Yeah, no, going back to my roots essentially from
Uh,
from a swordsman to outcast and Mead to
Inner city kid.
yeah, inner city kid. How's um how's life been with you?
Not too bad. Just busy. Kind of between studies at the moment. So just getting a lot of stuff down on paper that I probably should have gotten down on paper ages ago. But so just catching up on bits of writing, busy teaching, um, all that fun stuff.
Any sneak peek on what papers you're actually working on at the
Uh,
moment?
yeah, so we've I suppose three really. Yeah, one of them is when we presented at a conference there, an online conference. It wasn't like a big thing or anything. It was just like I think us and like some WIT students, but at a it was kind of a qualitative study looking at the barriers and motivators that older adults perceive uh, or to exercise during the pandemic. Then the other one is kind of the perceptions of resistance training and strength training among older adults. So that was kind of qual as well. So in that, we just kind of asked them questions relating to strength training, resistance training, to kind of get a better idea of what they understood it to be and what they thought it would entail. And then the kind of larger one was a randomized control trial. So we compared home strength training to Zoom delivery of strength training to a control. The control just carried on their daily lives. Um, we were looking at the effects of the delivery method on kind of like quality of life, some kind of functional tests. So kind of like sit, stand. Uh, I can't remember what other kind of measures Connor had. And then I was looking at things like self-efficacy, adherence, and retention, I think, as well.
Hmm.
So there was a little bit of qual stuff to go with that as well. So the qualitative stuff was just kind of their um, what they attributed to being able to engage with the program. So all kind of just getting written up now and put together, and then it's goes to begging journalists to actually accept it and publish it. So
Ideal. Kind
good.
of at least you're getting out some more good information for the old folk. I was actually only talking to a friend on Friday, and we were talking about that kind of subject matter and about just like the benefits of weight training in general. And I mentioned how older people should be doing resistance training, and he's like, "Sure, would that be bad for their bones?" It's like, no, 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 no.
I don't know,
One of the best things for their bones.
yeah.
And I was like, you should check out the episode we had with David Nolan. You might learn something.
um, yeah, definitely. I suppose it's kind of we're kind of lucky here where we are, just because like there's a good kind of scalp of older adults here in the area. There's about 100 around Carlow that we got involved in the study, so there does kind of seem to be like GPs are starting to send some of their patients our way into our kind of exercise thing that myself and Dowling are doing for older adults. So it is kind of getting more and more into the zeitgeist, I suppose, um, of older adults that they kind of do need to be doing some weight bearing exercises.
Mm.
Uh,
Think a huge thing that's helping with that is like more community based, like
oh,
strength group programs popping up around like villages and stuff like that. Um,
like what we tried to do, it was like we worked through the local sports partnership here in Carlos, so they're kind of like the sports arm of the council, and they were so helpful in setting up the whole thing. But I mean, it was a mutually kind of beneficial thing. We were running the study, and they were running a program. So Um,
I
hopefully,
suppose some of the stuff we're going to talk about today could help with the older adults as well, which lump them in somewhere in the category.
yeah, some of it.
So today we are going to be touching on two very, well, I suppose they are very effective sports supplements.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're two. They're probably the main two. So we're going to be touching on caffeine and creatine. So like few supplements are really worth like paying money for, and thankfully these two are pretty cheap and they're pretty effective. And as well, they're probably going to be allowed use in most sporting federations.
Yeah. Well, I think caffeine there was a certain dose. Do you know what? I'm just going to get this up.
I think I remember hearing that there was a certain amount that like past a
It was
certain
banned
threshold.
with water, 1 minute. So
Yeah.
yeah, caffeine was added to the list of banned substances by WADA in 1984, and or it was added to the banned list of substances by the IOC in 1984 and WADA in 2000. So the doping offence was defined as having about 15 nanograms per milliliter of urine. And then the threshold was reduced in 85 to 12 nanograms per milliliter. But then it was removed off the control list in 2004. But they still have recommendations on it is still monitored, and athletes are encouraged to maintain a urine caffeine concentration of below 12 nanograms of milliliters of urine.
What would that equate to in terms of
Yeah. So
like milligrams?
it corresponds to 10 milligrams per kg of
Ah,
body mass orally ingested over several hours. So
Christ, that's a lot of caffeine.
yeah.
Actually, just
10 milligrams per kg of body weight.
yeah, well, that'd be me consuming 900 milligrams, which is what, a lot of monsters.
800. I think you do that in meat there.
Yeah, potentially. I wouldn't like to see how you feel after it. Feel like you're on some serious come down. Actually, just a tangent before we get into this. I remember when I was doing my PT course. So this goes to show like the level of like kind of intellect or education that they would be giving you in these PT courses. So this guy who was giving me the educator, um, very against Monster Energy drinks.
Oh, like listen, any course at all where you're dealing with anyone I won't even say course, but just anyone over the age of 40 that's involved in.
But this guy was in his 30s. Like,
Was it?
oh yeah, he was like, a girl asked him, like, are Monster Energy drinks okay to eat? Because we were talking about sports supplements, and he said, does anybody here drink Monster Energy drinks? And like, I was the only person to put my hand up because everybody else is too afraid to put it up. And he's like, why do you drink Monster Energy drinks? And I was like, well, if I'm dieting, the low calorie ones are pretty handy for me to stick to my diet, get something sweet in, and then maybe they might help with a bit of performance and training. And he was like, you do know that has like what is 150 milligrams of caffeine? Is that? I was like, yeah, as that's not really too high to give you like somebody my size at the time was like 80 kilos, but that's not it's not too high to give me like some extremely dangerous dose. And he's like, well, would you give that to a child? And I was like, but I'm not a child. Like that's irrelevant. Like it's like just moving the goalposts completely.
Yeah,
Like
completely. Like, yeah.
anyway, so that's enough of my shy talk. So Lawrence, what is caffeine? Why should we take it? How does it
Uh,
work? Dosage?
so caffeine is probably the most widely used psychoactive substance we have. So it is kind of by psychoactive, we kind of just means that works on the brain and it's naturally occurring. So you get it unlike the bro you encountered. It is naturally occurring, and we get it through coffee, tea, cocoa, or coca. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Is it coca or cocoa or coca?
Could be either or cacao even.
Oh, fuck, there's no recover button. But the commonly ingested form in those kind of energy drinks, Red Bull, and in most sports supplements will be caffeine anhydrous. Now there is lots of different versions of caffeine, but that's kind of the main one we'd be using in kind of sporting or performance settings. Usually it's a white odorless powder. Comes in pill form, or you can see it kind of on the labels of most Monster drinks. If you do digest it, there is some transfer in the mouth, but kind of for the most part, we're going to be talking about digestion of it and what happens in the stomach. So it is kind of rapidly absorbed in the stomach and gastrointestinal tract. And caffeine is a substance that is kind of referred to as hydrophobic. So when we say hydrophobic, it doesn't bond easily with water. And that's quite important because of how easily caffeine passes through most membranes, and that, but your membranes, your body, we mean, and that includes the blood-brain barrier. So it does actually cross the blood-brain barrier, which is kind of important when we talk about its effects on the adenosine receptors. So adenosine is a big, it plays a big role in sleep. So we kind of, obviously, all of us kind of use caffeine if we're feeling a little bit tired, a little bit shitty, a little bit groggy. So just kind of keep it in the back of your heads that caffeine is important in crossing that blood-brain barrier. But when we have a coffee or we drink a Monster or something, you will kind of start to feel a little bit of a pickup almost immediately because of how quickly caffeine crosses those barriers, those membranes. But when we ingest caffeine, a lot of kind of factors go into how quickly we see levels peak in our blood. So kind of if you were reading a study, it might say peak plasma levels or T max. But you're talking anywhere from 30 to 120 minutes, depending on your fed state and your own kind of, obviously, with individuality, there we will see variance in people. But the interesting thing about caffeine that I wasn't aware of is that the bioavailability of caffeine. So how much of the actual substance becomes active in your bloodstream is actually really high. So it's almost nearly at, or it's quite close to 100%. And obviously, like, the absorption in the gut is from drinks or from food. So drinks, obviously, obvious ones like coffee and tea, Monster, I don't know, rain, depends on your or poison, but you do can get it from food. So foods like chocolate can have some caffeine content as well. But the absorption rate and the metabolism breakdown rate are highly individual. Then, so let's say you ingest your Monster, or I would probably say you drink it rather than ingest it. It sounds a bit less clinical. So let's say you guzzle, you horse down that fucking Monster. But so you do that before you've an idea that you should be doing it before your training session, but probably a good idea to get that Monster into you about 40 minutes to half an hour before your training session. So by the time you're warmed up, it's starting to kick in. Then we start to see, we will obviously start to see a decline of caffeine in your bloodstream, and that's referred to as the half-life. So once it reaches its peak, obviously you will start to see a decline in levels, but the average kind of half-life of caffeine is between 4 and 6 hours, and obviously that can vary from individual to individual, but that variance can be anywhere from I think 1.5 hours to 10 hours. So there's a lot of variance there. The half-life of caffeine. But just for anyone that doesn't really know what half-life is, when we're talking about half-life of a drug, It's just the time taken for the plasma concentration, so the blood concentration of the drug, to reduce to half of its original value. And that's kind of a widely used term in pharmacology, just to see how long it takes for a drug to be ingested and broken down and eventually leave your body. So that half-life is continuous or continues out. So you should have a half the amount of that drug. So let's say you ingest 200 milligrams, the half-life is 6 hours. So 6 hours later, you should have 100 milligrams, and then 6 hours later, you should have 50, and then 6 hours later, you should have 25, so on and so forth. So that's roughly how long it takes to remove the drug from your body. I think that's kind of important for people to understand for sleep, maybe, Shane, that if you're banging in 300 milligrams of caffeine, there is still probably 200 to 150 milligrams knocking around your system by 11 or 12 o'clock.
Yeah, and like, I mean, you will know if you're one of those people who's like a fast metabolizer of caffeine. You know, there is people out there who somehow can have, like, you know, their pre-workout like 7 p.m. in the evening, and be able to fall into bed like that night. So, like, I mean, is it something that you should experiment with to see? Like, depends if you're kind of bound to any particular schedule. I'd probably err on the side that if you have trouble sleeping in the evening anyway, probably not something worth experimenting with, and probably looking to keep your caffeine intake to the early hours of the day.
No, 100% I'd agree with that. Just because, like, if you were, uh, even if you were sure that you were a good sleeper, I just don't think it's worth taking the risk, because it is fairly catastrophic on your sleep.
Yeah.
I'm going to kind of talk a little bit on how caffeine works. I do not claim to have an in-depth knowledge of the physiology of this. I'm only roughly talking about a little bit on how it works in your central nervous system, maybe a little bit of an effect on it might have at a muscular level. And after that, when I kind of, like, the original idea of caffeine, and it is kind of widely talked, not widely, but kind of still believed in kind of bodybuilding circles, is that it uh, kind of had an effect on mobilizing fatty acids a bit more than it did, and uh, so that contributing a little bit more maybe to caffeine's effects, but kind of a lot of the effects of caffeine seem to be much more kind of central nervous system related than down to kind of metabolic, I suppose. But the kind of main action we're going to be worried about in the strength sphere, bodybuilding sphere, will obviously be its effects on central nervous system, and that's kind of accepted as the main mechanism how it affects performance. So when we say something working for performance, we kind of a term a lot of people will use will be something being ergogenic. So if something is ergogenic, we would say it's for performance. So kind of the main ergogenic effects of caffeine are myofibrillar calcium availability. So calcium is obviously really plays a really important role in muscular contraction, and calcium binds to troponin, causes the position change in tropomyosin, and that leaves it open for actin to bind to the myosin and actually allow for muscular contraction. So when we kind of know that it does kind of bear an effect on more calcium being available for contractions, that's obviously going to play a really important role in it. There is some increased substrate availability because it does kind of have an effect on adrenaline or epinephrine. If you're from Australia, you'd call it epinephrine, but if you're anywhere else in the world, you'd call it adrenaline.
Yeah.
That's really fucking confusing as well if you're a sports science or just student or just reading papers. and something's from Australia and you're eating it and it says epinephrine and you're like, what in the fuck is this? So just clear that
That's
up.
an American thing as well, isn't it?
Is there? Maybe it is. Maybe it's American. But yeah.
Apologies to all our American and Australian listeners, that which there is none at the moment.
Shout out to Connor and Ian as well. Hopefully the two Lyle boys are listening. But anyway, so caffeine's main effect, and obviously this main effect is going to be why it works on sleep, or why it has such a big effect on your sleep and general alertness. Is caffeine's main effect is because it's antagonism to adenosine receptors. So if something is antagonistic to adenosine receptors, it means it has a propensity to bind to the same site that adenosine would. And that leads to increases in kind of neurotransmitter release, motor unit firing rates, and some kind of pain suppression effects as well. So neurotransmitters are carriers of signals, and motor unit firing rates. Motor units are the bits in our muscle that carry the message from our brain to our muscle. And pain suppression, that kind of should be self-explanatory there. It's just less pain. That's how it works. Or those are the kind of main mechanisms. And obviously, like we know with adenosine, high concentrations of adenosine leads to decreases in some central nervous system neurotransmitters like dopamine, like serotonin, adrenaline or noradrenaline, and glutamate. So all of those are quite important, and I think acetylcholine you can add into that as well. But so we know adenosine decreases all of these neurotransmitters, which play a really, really important role for carrying messages quickly from the brain to the muscles. They also play an important role in mood, in kind of feeling good, which obviously, if you feel good, if you feel a little bit more alert, should have some benefits on performance. So caffeine binds to compete with adenosine to the receptor site. So it binds to the adenosine receptor, and caffeine, because caffeine binds that receptor, we see an increased number of the concentration of those neurotransmitters. The availability of them increases. So that's kind of why we see kind of better effects on mood, alertness, after coffee. So if somebody, people will often turn around to me and say, "Oh, you didn't have your coffee this morning." No, I fucking didn't. And that's why my mood is not so great. So for anyone out there who would be caffeine dependent, like me, and the mood isn't great in the morning before coffee, there's some validity to that.
Another thing as well, it's typically it is going to be like glycogen sparing as well. So one of the kind of things that caffeine does, it can help stimulate lipolysis, which is like the breakdown of fatty acids for energy. So if you are somebody who's doing maybe like very high volume training blocks or high volume sessions, and like realistically true resistance training, you're not going to be depleting too much glycogen anyway. But if maybe you're in a lower fed state, maybe having some caffeine in the system could help you to kind of use those fatty acid stores before you tap into your glycogen stores, which could help when you're like in a deficit or you're very, very low body fat and are not eating a terrible amount of food.
But then I suppose we're kind of maybe moving to dosages. So which are kind of general dosages, you could see an effect on the central nervous system from doses of little, from 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So 1 milligram of caffeine per kilogram of body weight could just be a coffee. So like a shot of espresso. And if you were going into that 3 milligrams per kilo of body weight, you're kind of maybe 2 cans of Monster would kind of be a good discernible measurement there for most people. So 2 cans of Monster For me, or let's say for a 100 kilo male, 2 cans of Monster will give them 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. Whereas for somebody maybe around 75 kilos, so maybe for the smaller people among us.
75 kilos is pretty average human
Is
these
it?
days. Yeah.
Oh fuck, right.
But like 100 kilos, that's large and jacked. 75 kilos is pretty bang average. I'd say like the smaller individuals, like the 50 to 60 kilos.
I'll tell you how your brain works, how
Yeah.
my brain works. So conditioned to fucking deal with jack hunts. But so anyway, but if you drank a can of Monster and you weighed 75 kilos, that'll give you roughly 2 milligrams per kilogram body weight, which would be a good healthy dose of caffeine, and should give you some of those ergogenic effects. So there is kind of an effect that caffeine has on strength training. So kind of the main two, which probably caffeine does offer, is reduced RPE. So if you were to take, I suppose an easy way of explaining this is if you were to take caffeine and do a set of 8 reps on bench at an RPE of, or sorry, if you were to do 8 reps with 100 kilos on bench, you did one set or 1 day with caffeine and 1 day without caffeine. The day with caffeine, that RP of the set might be lower, whereas without the caffeine, the RP be higher. And that kind of does seem to be related a little bit to the dopamine response, or the dopamine kind of effects of caffeine, that you just kind of feel a little bit better. You're a little bit more awake, a little bit more alert. So there is kind of a little bit of an effect caffeine has at a muscular level. So there is kind of a pathway that caffeine does kind of affect, and that's calcium ion mobilization. So again, it just frees up caffeine to bind to that troponin site, cause the position change of tropomyosin, actin binds to the myosin, and we see change in the head. But it could also work in the sodium potassium pump activity. So as an electrical impulse comes in to the motor unit, we tend to see, or not tend to see, we do see sodium and potassium ions change place, and that kind of facilitates the impulse or the action potential being realized, and facilitates the excitation contraction coupling for muscle contraction. But what we're really concerned about would be caffeine for strength. So most of what we know about caffeine for strength is from a guy, I'm going to absolutely bastardize his name. It's Grgic.
Yeah, Croatian dude.
Grgic, Croatian guy, worked with Brad Schoenfield on a load of papers. But most of what we know about caffeine is from him. He's done 2 meta-analysis on caffeine ingestion for strength and force production, so probably a good idea to look at him. But he kind of recommends for strength tasks to go as high as 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body mass to get the full effect. And he recommends that to be consumed anywhere from 30 to 90 minutes before exercise, depending on kind of on the factors we talked about earlier, depending on caffeine, your time to rise in plasma levels, and obviously the kind of assimilation and breakdown rates. So just to be clear, 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram body mass. In layman's terms, that would probably be for a 100 kilo male, about 4 cans of Monster. So, or maybe 8 shots of espresso or something in around that. So quite a large dose.
Yeah.
So I suppose without kind of bogging people down, like those meta-analysis, they kind of saw effect sizes, and effect sizes just kind of tell you the strength of the change that we see from an intervention. And those kind of 2 meta-analysis saw small effect sizes, and they were, I think, 0.6 to 0.2 No, they don't sound a lot, but when you have a percentage change of kind of anywhere from like 1 to 6% or 2 to 7%, particularly in powerlifting, like if you told me this supplement was going to add 7% onto my total,
Yeah.
you jump at it. Like especially like if you're someone, like just for example, if you're someone that totals 700 kilos, adding another 7% to that is what, the guts of 50 kilos, is it?
Another 7%. I'm no mathematician, man. I just count sets and reps. That's it.
Seven sevens is 49. So let's square. Well, you can't add 49 kilos to your total, but let's say 50 kilos. Like if you were told this supplement is going to add 50 kilos onto your total, I feel like most people would bite the hand off you for it.
Yeah, especially like you just take it.
It's that's all it is. You literally take it and try not to shit yourself. That's
Yeah.
your job.
Yeah, that's another thing to kind of like take into account with the higher dosages. Like while the higher dosages like seem to give like the most ergogenic effect, they are also the dosages which people find the most discomfort at.
Yeah.
Like if you've ever taken too much pre-workout or had too many coffees, you know that kind of jittery feeling that you get, and almost like the feeling of, it does like increase feelings of anxiety too. Um, like I know anytime I've went towards the higher ends, I've always like been pumping sweat during a session, feel really jittery, and also would be shitting the gym out of it as well, because it does stimulate your bowels, you know. So that's why if you have to do more on coffee, you know what happens after that. Number two. So you know, it's just one thing to kind of take into consideration. You know, if you're going to your powerlifting gym to do to do your training, just make sure to clean up the toilet after yourself. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. But anyway, so if you aren't taking competition or can't taking competition, if you aren't taking caffeine before your heavier stuff, you are potentially robbing yourself of some performance gains.
Mm.
Even in training, if you aren't, I would argue, if you aren't regularly taking caffeine, um, because of the effects we know it has on reducing RP. We know it has effects on your central nervous system. You are probably chronically robbing yourself of performance gains. So I think it is a good idea for most people to add in. I think, I don't know about you, but a lot of people seem to be worried about caffeine dependence.
Yeah.
I don't really understand it, because it's like there is, even with chronic abuse of caffeine, like there's very little to no long-term side effects from it. Like I mean, uh, I don't know, was there a study that like in America on people that report see, it's cross-sectional then as well, so it's very hard to, with epidemiological data, to
Mm.
actually draw real conclusions from it. But
The one where they had 4 to 20 cups of coffee a day or something like that. That
yeah,
saw health benefits. Yeah, yeah. So
I mean, again, it's not a, you can't hang your heart on it, but even
mm,
with a report really long term high amounts of caffeine, they're
yeah, I suppose like I wouldn't really be worried too much about it unless it was, you know, like impacting your sleep, and if that was like causing some degree of sleep deprivation, and then causing some kind of vicious cycle where you have to drink caffeine to get yourself through the day, and then it's impacting your sleep, and that does like happen a fair bit, I suppose. So like, you know, if it's impacting other things like that in your life, yeah, maybe you look at kind of scaling it back.
yeah, yeah. I think we've all been there when we were 16 and we finished school. You dry heave 2 or 3 scoops of pre workout and then go into the weights room for 2 or 3 hours, and then you end up staring at the ceiling for till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning.
So like,
Maybe that's just me.
if I'm sure some of the listeners will be aware, but like back in the day, and still to this day, actually, like in some pre-workouts, that it will be spiked with like one of the main ingredients is going to be caffeine in most pre-workouts. Okay, in a lot of pre-workouts they don't dose anything else really great, but just mainly caffeine. But back in the day, and still sometimes in some supplements these days, you may find things that are slightly like amphetamine. So you can get an extra buzz off them. You don't have to bring your speed to the gym. You can just take pre-workout. It's okay.
Yeah. But even you mad cunts taking like ephedrine before a training session.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever taken ephedrine, but ephedrine is an absolute Hail Mary of a stimulant. You just don't know what you're going to get because it's not a controlled substance. So like oftentimes when you are using it, you're using it from like fucking, it's like a brand that's like Black Dungeon supplements or something like that. It's made 100% made in some lads fucked back of some lads car. There's no way it's like, if it says like it's 1 milligram or 5 milligrams or whatever the fuck it is, there's no way it's actually that. It's accurate in its dosing. So just buyer beware when you are buying your pre-workouts. As Shane said, just I don't know, try and buy from My Protein or bulk powders or more reputable brands. So on we go to your end. So I just covered that up for strength gains. For acute strength gains, we're kind of talking 3 to 6 milligrams of caffeine per gram of body. Or Jesus Christ, I'm after making fucking balls of that. It's 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. Yeah, that's it. Right. Anyway.
Okay. So
to the most researched sports supplement.
Yeah, everybody's favorite white powder.
Everyone's favorite steroid.
Creatine. So yeah, we're gonna touch on creatine, in particular, creatine monohydrate. So you can get lots of different forms of creatine. So like creatine ethyl ester. There's like creatine nitrate as well.
All right, creatine malate, creatine digluconate.
Yeah.
Like the esters are endless.
Yeah. So there is a lot of them, but creatine monohydrate outperforms them all. In like there's a meta-analysis done in 2021, and that compared all the different types of creatines, and creatine monohydrate won every time, and it was cheaper as well. So like
it always fucks up my head so much when I turn around to someone and I'm like, do you use creatine? And they do powerlifting or bodybuilder, like, oh no, not really. I'm like, why do you not use it? It is like, it's so cheap. Like it doesn't make sense how the two most effective sports supplements are by far the cheapest as well. Like you can buy a kilogram bag of creatine for like €15, and you can buy like I think of caffeine tablets for like maybe €4 or €5.
Like they're kind of no brainers really, especially like with the amount of things that creatine does impact. Like it's like it wouldn't even if you didn't even have an interest in strength training, it'd probably be something that you should take anyway, because there is benefits for like cognitive health, and even in like aging adults, which we were talking about at the start, like you can help with like decreasing like the kind of effects of sarcopenia. So yeah, creatine monohydrate, very very cheap. If you don't buy it, hopefully you want to buy it after this. So essentially how creatine works. So we have some energy systems that play a role in how we do things throughout the day. So we have our ATP CP system, so adenosine triphosphate creatine phosphocreatine system, and then we have the anaerobic system, and we have the aerobic system. All right, so creatine is going to mainly impact the first two of those. So the ATP creatine or ATP phosphocreatine system. Get that fucking mixed up.
Often referred to as the ATP PCR.
Yeah, just gonna call it ATP PCR. Okay, it's just easier to do. Okay, so ATP, we need that for muscular contraction. Okay, so every time we produce a muscular contraction, one of those phosphates breaks off the triphosphate, and then it comes to adenosine diphosphate. To make another muscular contraction, we need ATP to come around again. Okay, so that cycle needs to be regenerated. the ATP PCR system essentially is going to facilitate a lot of this. And as we have increased creatine stores, it can increase the amount of recycling of these phosphates that we can do to essentially phosphorylate the adenosine diphosphate at that time. So then that we can produce more contractions more rapidly. Okay. And obviously, if we don't have these stores built up and we don't have a very kind of efficient recycling system, what essentially happens is that we just can't produce as many contractions. So we fatigue a bit earlier in a set. And then over a long term, so over an entire set or over an entire training week, we may not necessarily produce as much training volume. So then this effect on training volume, and training volume being an important process for, or an important factor for increasing strength, increasing muscle growth. If this is less than it would be if we had an enhanced recycling system, that can have a negative impact on our gains. So that's like very simply kind of what it does. Are you going to say something there, Lawrence?
No, absolutely not. No. I just kind of remember. I suppose just when you said something, I like. It was just kind of when people do kind of start taking creatine. There's kind of a couple of misconceptions. Even I was talking to someone I trained there the other day in the gym, and there's kind of an idea that it'll make you watery,
Yeah.
it'll make your hair fall out, just these kind of things that don't really make a ton of sense. They're not really backed in any way by any studies. I think there was one study that looked at creatine's effect on hair loss in males, and it wasn't really really conclusive.
Yeah, like I didn't look too much into the hair loss stuff now, if I'm being honest, because it's just one of those things. I'm like, that's a pretty like well, it is like one of the common concerns people have. It's like also very easily debunked, and you can just Google
Oh,
search that
yeah,
and you'll
yeah.
find out that that's false pretty much straight away. However, there is some kind of merit to the like water kind of thing. Okay, so like there will be some degree of water retention when you do start taking creatine. So your body will start to absorb a little bit more water. However, it's not going to be stored like extracellularly, so like outside the cell, which would happen if you went on the piss for the weekend and then you started to retain water and you had a big puffy face and like you looked all soft around your abs, right? That's not exactly what's happening. So all the water is being stored intracellularly. So creatine has storage sites. So obviously for this process to take place, of this ATP recycling, like it needs to be stored somewhere, so our body has endogenous stores of it. It's not something that is completely foreign to us. Our body can make it from just amino acids. So we have, I think it's methionine, glycine, and then is it arginine? So sorry, glycine, arginine, and methionine. So they're the kind of amino acids that it comes from. So it is an amino acid compound. However, it's important to realize that while it's an amino acid, and amino acids or amino acid compound, amino acids do contribute to protein. We don't count it as dietary protein. It doesn't contribute to protein synthesis. Okay, so that's an important thing to note. All right, so even though it can enhance training volumes and enhance training performance, and maybe allows for like to have a better stimulus essentially to grow muscle, it's not going to actually stimulate protein synthesis.
I suppose it's more, like you said, it's more facilitative than having
Yeah,
a, yeah, yeah.
yeah. Like hypertrophy is like a stimulus based process. You need the training stimulus to come in. It's similar to, you could have the most optimal protein dosage across the day, like the hitting the leucine threshold, bang on the money, having the best sources. But if you're not training, like you're not going to get bigger. And that's actually the exact same with creatine as well. So while creatine does have favorable effects on being able to gain lean mass, so if you start taking creatine today in your training, over the next few weeks, you could expect to see your weight go up by a kilo or two from that water being held or stored within your muscle cells, and kind of increasing the amount of creatine storage facilities there. All right, so your kind of lean mass technically will go up. So like there is some degree of kind of water retention that will come with it, but it is going to be you know, intracellularly, your muscles are probably just going to look a bit fuller as opposed to anything. And that can also be something that stops people from taking creatine in the first place. So people who maybe fat loss is their goal, maybe like very under kind of populated in the research is like young females, because they won't, like as soon as weight goes up, they don't want to take part in the study anymore. It's kind of funny, isn't it, that like most diet research is done in females, and then when it comes to the resistance training kind of supplementation side of things, like it's pretty much all males.
We were actually having a conversation about, I know it's a bit of a segue now, but we were actually having a conversation about it the other day in the office, that I do kind of understand why there would be a preference towards males in kind of testing. Say if I wanted to know if front squats versus back squats were more effective on 50-meter sprint times or something. It does kind of make sense that researchers would tend to lean towards males, just because there's less variability in the population, or in the sample from the population that you've drawn. Because obviously with women there would be kind of a lot more in terms of their stages of their cycle, kind of
menstrual cycle as well.
Yeah, exactly, what stage of their cycle they'd be on. So I suppose with men there'd be more homogeneity, i.e. like less variance of the sample. But I think what's really, I don't know, definitely from kind of the sports side end, is there does need to be a lot more research done in women to know if what results we have in males are actually transferable across. But
yeah, I suppose it's kind of just a best guess at the moment, really. Sometimes with trained females.
Hopefully a lot of those questions get answered. But anyway, sorry.
Okay, so I mentioned that creatine is something that is like naturally occurring, so we can make it from these amino acids. So one thing that people may ask is like, well, if we can get it from amino acids and we can get amino acids from food, can we not just eat food rather than take this lovely white powder? You know, and that is, that is a valid question. And yes, we can get creatine from food. So like red meat is going to have a decent amount of creatine in it. So is different types of fish, so salmon, herring. However, to get the actual dose of creatine that you would get from, like, you know, your supplementation, which could be on average around 5 grams a day, that's what most people are going to be taking, all right? To get that from beef, for example, you'd probably have to be eating almost close to like over 500 grams potentially a day, you know, which, you know,
that much, I suppose, in the grander scheme of things. But I suppose for the average person that isn't going to be me or you who's eating nearly a kilo of meat a day, but
like 500 grams or like north of 500 grams is, first of all, expensive. It'd be like, you know, that's one of the benefits of creatine monohydrate, isn't it? It's that it's cheap. You can buy it like a bag for €10, and that's going to last you the entire month. If you want to get all your creatine from beef, to get over like half a kilo, you probably are going to be spending around, you know, 15 to 20 quid a day if you're buying like decent stuff, you know, which is like not very feasible for most people. So that's why we would look to get it from the supplementation as opposed to getting it from meat. It's just not really practical. And even in the likes of like research studies, they won't even like see if the dietary creatine is going to be better than the actual powder, because, like, you know, you can't really kind of have controls, or you can't blind people to, okay, you're having 10 fillet steaks and you're having a white powder and you're having nothing, you know. So or you're having like a fake powder, you know. You can't do that, as well as being, again, one of the limitations of in research is funding. You know, good luck to you finding somebody who's going to fund like, you know, the 10 fillet steak a day diet, other than maybe big beef.
Yeah.
So like they're kind of practicalities that you need to take into consideration, as well as just like, you know, who's going to want to eat that much meat a day to get in creatine,
Sounds, do you know what? Sounds all right, really, though.
yeah. Well, like when you take, like if you're eating other foods, like that's it's a lot of protein as well. Like if you're having over half a kilo of like red meat a day, that's a ton of protein as well. Probably more than you probably need.
One
Um,
of my meals at the moment is 400 grams, 400 grams meat.
there you go.
So, potatoes. But I think, yeah, but I think the point is for the average kind of gym guy, gym gal, uh, they're probably not going to be getting in 500 grams of mince in a day. They're probably have more variance in the protein sources, probably have more dairy based sources, probably more chicken and or at least white, kind of white meat and
Yeah,
based protein sources, which are a little bit lower in creatine.
yeah, and as well, I suppose like while we're talking about creatine here, like the creatine is not the only nutrient that a lot of those foods will have. So like if you are consuming a terrible amount of saturated fat, like over the long term, it's probably not going to be great for your health outcomes. So even if you are getting all your creatine in, I mean, I don't think having a really high LDL cholesterol is going to be really favorable in the long term for you. Yeah, although you might have unbelievable gains. Um. So anyway, in regards to like kind of dosaging creatine, one thing that people come across first, or one question they'll have is like, do I need to load it? And also, how often or how long can I take it for? So, do you need to load it? I would say no. I don't think unless you have a really like if you have if you don't have a deadline to have yourself loaded or your muscle stores loaded with creatine, you're probably better off not to. You're just going to end up going through your tub or your bag quicker. So a loading phase typically is about 5 grams per day, or sorry, 5 grams 5 times per day, 4 to 5 times a day. So 20 to 25 grams a day for 5 days. And that should have your muscle stores saturated in that kind of time period. Or you could take 5 grams a day for 2 or 3 weeks and you get to the same place, really. So like with that, then the higher dosages are the ones that people tend to have the most adverse effects. So creatine, for the most part, is extremely safe. It doesn't seem to have any negative effect on people, like in terms of health, unless you have dodgy kidneys. So if you do have dodgy kidneys, like it's definitely something you probably shouldn't go towards unless you've consulted with a doctor. But I don't know why to give you a pass anyway. But if you've got healthy kidneys, like it's completely fine. The main side effects that people will know are the water retention, which you've already discussed. Not really an issue if you understand that it's water being retained in your muscles. Then another one is going to be GI upset. So just having like stomach cramps and feel a bit nauseated. But that is typically seen in that loading phase and in the higher dosages, like maybe over 10 grams a day might cause that. So that's why you wouldn't take, if you're doing a loading phase, you wouldn't take the 25 grams in one go. Like that'd be disgusting. You would try to split that over the day, like in even doses, essentially. So with that, then after that loading phase, what you could look at doing is, so a very common and standard dose is 5 grams a day. However, often in the research, they will look at using relative doses. So, which does make sense. Like we use relative doses
For else.
for everything, like, for protein, for fat, for carbs. So why should I take the same amount of creatine as like, a 50 kilo female,
Yeah.
even though we're not that far off each other,
Or closer to the 50 kilo keep female, I think, than I would be at least. So,
but yeah, so like with that, then we could look at maybe using like 0.1 g, so 0.1 grams per kilogram body weight. So for myself, who's 90 kilos, I'd probably look at taking around 9 grams per day. All right, and then how long can you take that for? You can pretty much take it indefinitely. So it doesn't really seem like there's any kind of like amount of adaptation that you get from taking more, or non-response that you get from taking creatine. And I think it's one of those ones that, because it is extremely safe to take in regular doses over the long term, and it does have continue to give the benefits. I don't really see, unless unless you get bored of taking it or you run out of money somehow and you can't afford any more creatine, like why you would stop. So so yeah, that's how you would dose it anyway. And in regards to timing, actually, so that's another thing to touch on. So timing doesn't really matter when you take it. So take it whenever is most convenient for you. I know for myself anyway, when I'm taking my supplements, I just take them first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
Now with that as well, taking the creatine first in the morning, some people may be a bit concerned about, like, if can I take creatine close to my caffeine intake. So that's something that I suppose you didn't cover in your segment, is like the effect that maybe creatine and caffeine have on one another. And to be honest, like, there doesn't seem to be any really strong kind of research to say that they would have a negative effect on one another or they'd have an interference effect. But if you are concerned about it, like, you could potentially just take your creatine around like in the morning, and then maybe just prioritize your caffeine around your training time, or maybe have your creatine after your training session and then have your caffeine before. It really depends on how, like, where in your day can you keep consistent with it and just continue to take it, because it's one of those supplements that, like, I'd even have clients be like, I'm gonna get back into taking creatine, or I take my creatine some days and don't forget it. I forget it other days, and it's like, well, realistically, if unless you're taking it consistently, you're probably not going to be getting your muscle stores like saturated as well as you could and getting the full benefit. Like, so that is, oh yeah, another point that we have to touch on is there is going to be people that creatine is more effective for. Okay, so people who already consume a decent amount of dietary creatine. So if you do eat already a decent amount of red meat or a decent amount of fish, you probably, like, won't get as much of an ergogenic benefit from having creatine supplementation. People who will get the most are going to be vegans and vegetarians, because the foods that contain creatine are not going to be in your diet. Okay, so potentially somebody who is a vegan or vegetarian, or who is vegan or vegetarian, you will get an even higher response than, like, I myself or Lawrence would. So it would definitely be something that you should have in your arsenal. People who are more meat eaters, you will see a lot of people who will say, I don't get anything from it, or there are people who are termed as non-responders, and they do exist. However, like, things that can help with these people is maybe consuming a slightly higher dose, and maybe prioritizing a bit more in regards to the training, around training window, see if that can help, and maybe having it with some carbs, which may help with uptake.
Yeah, and maybe even probably, I don't know, would maybe a loading phase potentially saturate, or I don't know, is there any kind of data on that, on kind of non-responders loading, as opposed to just kind of using and gradually hoping that the levels will come up?
Mm. Yeah, and, like, look, if you are getting the likes of, like, the water retention initially as you take it on, like, that's probably a good thing, because you are probably responding to the creatine, as opposed to just pissing it all out, which can happen as well in the loading phases. Like, if you're going to be dosing with super high amounts, you could just be kind of pissing a lot of it out, which is obviously not what you want.
No.
Is there anything else to touch on? Oh yeah, so in regards to kind of storage of creatine, I probably wouldn't be keeping it in, like, fluid for too long. So ideally, if you are going to take it, like, take it pretty rapidly once you put it into some kind of solution like a drink, because it does degrade quite quickly depending on, like, the acidity or the pH of the actual drink you're putting it in. So that's one thing you should watch out for if you're picking up some kind of energy drink, or you're picking up some kind of, like, the pre-workout shots, and they're like, oh, this has creatine in it. Like, it's probably not going to be too beneficial to you, because it's probably going to be, a lot of it is going to be degraded.
Yeah, it's just, I suppose, for people to kind of know that any kind of protein left in some kind of solute or kind of whatever, be it water or milk or anything, if you're putting, because creatine is a protein, it will kind of denature if it's left there for too long.
I think,
Yeah,
is that everything, or do you
is,
have anything that you want to ask me in regards to that?
I think that's everything.
Sweet. Yeah. So
I don't think we left much out. I think we were fairly, so we covered doses, we covered doses, we covered kind of the mechanisms. We covered a little bit on who should or should not use some of the supplements. I think with caffeine, it's kind of an obvious one. If you have like, if you're prone to like anxiety or you like cardiovascular issues, probably a bad idea to dose up on it. And I think you kind of went through yours there. So that's kind of everything.
yeah, that's grand then.
So
Just
hopefully, in
making
the next
sure.
episode we have Jane and Anna. I think hopefully coming on.
Yeah, and we'll definitely be talking a bit about creatine in regards to weight cuts as well, because that's definitely going to be a consideration for when you are trying to drop weight because of that water retention effect. It could be something that we do look to strip in a weight cut, but then again, maybe that's an extreme case. Like
Yeah,
maybe taking out in the a powerlifting peak is not the best thing. Like, if you can cut weight by other means, it's probably a bit more favorable. And realistically,
variation method.
yeah, like how long do you have to take it out to get the water to drop as well?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's pretty much it then. So I hope you enjoyed the podcast. So yeah, if you did enjoy it, just like it on whatever you're listening to it on. If you can like it, you can share it. You can share it onto your stories on Instagram. You can tell us that was great or that was shit. We love the constructive criticism. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the episode. Hope you learned a lot, and we'll talk to you in the next one.